Welcome back to Activate. We're on session 16. And last time we looked, if you remember, at our story. And remember, you told your story so brilliantly at the end. And this week's, we're going to look at God's story. And obviously, God's story and our story, we're going to see how they interplay with each other. So do you want to kick us off, Jen?
Yeah, so I think having practiced telling our own stories, we want to be able to segue into God's story too. And that can be done easily if we have included part of the gospel in our own story. So that's when we're talking about that bit about what is it that Jesus did to you? What difference has it made? That's that gospel input, isn't it, in our own stories? And there are lots of different ways of telling God's story, but today we are going to be looking at two really simple ways of telling God's story, because we want to make it easy to do, and you are going to have the opportunity to practice one of the two ways later today. So those two ways are the 4 points and the 3 circles. And I'm going to start with the 4 points. I really love the 4 points because they are simple. They're easy to remember. I feel like they work in loads of situations. I really love them. And they're 4 symbols that each mean something different. So we start with the heart, which is that stands for God loves me. So that's about really connecting people to the heart of God, then recognizing that actually God really does love them, and that the rest of the gospel story is only because he loves us. The next symbol is a cross, and it stands for I have sinned. And that's about helping people to recognize that they are not living in God's way, that they aren't living a life that God has called them into, and that the way that we live separates us from God. The next is the cross of Jesus, and it stands for Jesus died for me. So that's to help us connect people to the truth of the gospel, that because God loves us and we were sinful, he sent Jesus to die for us, to take our place, to take our punishment, our shame and our guilt, and give us freedom in its place. So the cross is our next one. So then the last symbol is a question mark, and that's because it's decision time. I need to decide to live for God, because having heard the gospel and having understood the gospel, everybody then has to make a decision. Are they going to live for God or not? We have to choose. So Nick, how would you tell your story, tell God's story using those 4 points?
Okay, well, first of all, the 4 points is a very flexible tool. It's not like you just recite those 4,
like little steps.
Yeah, exactly. You unpack it as you go through, you amplify it, you focus on the bits that seem to make more sense. You can have wristbands like these that have the 4 points on. I've got it down the side of my car. Often get people stop me and say, what do those symbols mean? And it's a great opportunity to start to share the gospel. So what I will normally do, Jen, is when somebody asks me what these 4 points mean, and I've got it on t-shirts, sweatshirts, you can get them on caps. If you go to the 4points.com, it's in your notes, you can find all the merchandise there. But what I often like to say is, I'm so glad you asked me that. It's an amazing story that helps me explain life. Or it's an incredible story that helps me understand how to make life work. So I kind of preface it with it's all about a story. So I unpack it as a story, but I'll also weave in my own story as I'm telling it. So, for example, I say, well, the first symbol is the heart, and I will talk about the fact that actually I was amazed when I discovered that actually God loved me. And not only that he loved me, but he had a purpose for my life. He created my life with meaning and purpose, which I had no knowledge of until somebody explained it to me. But that heart always reminds me that he not only loves us, but he has a purpose for our lives. When he created us with purpose. But this next symbol, the cross, I will often talk about the fact that not only has my life fallen short of God's standards, but I will talk about, some people find the brokenness of society an easy idea to understand. So I'll say, and I realize that actually, when I look at the world around me, I'm part of the problem. I'm part of the mess that we're in. And as a 12-year-old boy, when I first heard the message about Jesus, I understood that I was part of the problem, and I needed a solution to that problem of my own selfishness, my guilt, knowing that my life was going to head in a direction that wasn't going to end well. And that's when the next symbol, this other cross, came into being, when I understood and I heard for the first time that Jesus actually died for me and he died for you. And when he died on the cross, as an innocent person, he took my guilt and my shame, and he will offer the same for you as well, so that we can be forgiven to come into a relationship with a holy, holy God. And this last symbol, Jen, the question mark, this was the question that I was posed with as a 12-year-old boy, having heard and understood about Jesus, what he'd done for me, what decision was I going to make? And in a drafty field in the middle of Norfolk, where I was camping with a bunch of other kids, I made the decision I wanted to follow Jesus and invite him into my life. And that's what this question stands for each one of us. What are we going to do with this Jesus? So that's kind of how I will work that these four symbols into my own story, or weave my story into these four symbols. So we can start to mix the two up a little bit once we get used to explaining the 4 points in their most simple format, Jen.
Yeah, I love that they're really flexible and that you can use them really anywhere, can't you? And like, you can do a really long story with them, but you could also really quickly give someone the gospel, can't you, through those 4 points. Now, there are other ways for us to tell God's story, and in particular, his story of the love for the world and the whole of humankind, and his plan and purpose for the world. And we're going to do that by looking at a quick video of the 3 circles. And the 3 circles is a really, really, again, quite an easy tool to use, but you do need a pen and a paper. But it is a really great thing to use off the cuff quite quickly. You know, write it on a scrap of paper, on a napkin if you're sat in a coffee shop. It works really well for those situations.
Could draw it on the sand if you're on the beach.
You could, yes, actually, yeah. You could draw it on the sand in the
or if your car hasn't been washed for a while, you could do it in the dirt on the back of your car.
You could do that in my car quite easily, I think. And I think if you want to be a bit bolder in using the 3 circles, you can just ask somebody, have you heard of the 3 circles? They'll probably say no, and it'll give you the opportunity to go, oh, well, can I show you, or can I explain it to you? And I think what's really nice about it is that because you're busy sort of drawing it out while you're talking, you're not actually making loads of eye contact, which for most people, they find quite helpful, because the 3 circles gets right to the heart of the gospel pretty quickly, doesn't it? Yep. And it can be helpful for people to not feel embarrassed when you're asking some of the questions around it. So let's watch that video now.
Yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Every time I watch this, I feel profoundly moved.
I couldn't agree more.
It touches my heart. And I think, oh, yes, I want to talk about Jesus too. So I hope you feel the same way.
Has anyone showed you the 3 circles before?
Have you heard of the
3 circles before?
Has anyone ever shared
The 3 circles with you?
before?
No.
So this is the first circle. So this represents the world that's broken.
All of us live in a broken world.
You only have to tune on the news and see
Suffering, death,
War, sickness.
rape, disease, it's everywhere, right?
But you know, God didn't actually create the world to be like this, full of brokenness, eh? Here's the second circle.
This circle represents God's perfect design.
God's perfect design was a world without brokenness.
A world full of love.
Full of joy.
and peace and unity.
But what we did was we sinned.
Sin could be anything from lying to murder.
Wait, so like just like normal lying or like hard lying?
And what sin did, it separated us from God's perfect design and threw us into brokenness.
And so people try all kinds of different things to get out of brokenness. They might try drugs or alcohol.
Or maybe chasing a career or money.
Smoking. Even bullying other people at school.
Oh, sleeping around, suicide, exactly, a good example. But it doesn't actually fix the problem of brokenness.
It's like a bungee cord. We just get snapped straight back into brokenness.
And ultimately, if people die in that state of brokenness, they're separated from God, and that means that that's eternal separation from God.
Do you know what this place is often called? Yes.
What God did was, he didn't want to leave us in that place.
God loved us so much that he sent
his son Jesus to die on the cross.
Jesus was God, so he had no sin. And when he died and rose again, he actually took on all of our sin and cancelled it, like he crushed it.
He said if we would turn away from our sin and believe in Jesus and make Jesus
the Lord of our life,
We become restored back into God's original design.
And you become a new creation, a new person in Christ.
And will restore us back into relationship with Him. So there's only two kinds of people in this world. People that are in brokenness or God's perfect design. Where would you see yourself?
Probably right there, to be honest.
This circle.
I'm not sure.
Love?
Brokenness?
Possibly a couple of love.
The bungee stage.
Yeah, the same.
And where would you like to
So where would you like to be? You'd like to be here? Yeah.
Right there. Middle of this star circle.
One with God? So here? So is there anything that's stopping you?
From turning and believing in Jesus?
And allow him to be Lord and King of your life.
Stubbornness?
Probably not.
Probably weed, to be honest.
Nothing stopping me.
You know the awesome news about Jesus? He is the only way out.
If you try to clean yourself up before coming to Jesus, it's like trying to get clean before you take a shower.
Oh, I see, yeah, I get that.
Is there anything stopping you?
We shared the 3 circles with 34 people. 4 were already believers. 13 chose to remain in brokenness, but some were deeply impacted. And 17 wanted to leave brokenness and receive Christ. There are many powerful ways to share the gospel, and the 3 circles is a great place to start.
So, Jen, one of the things that we also talk about when we talk about telling God's story is the bigger story, because the 4 points particularly focuses on the key aspects of what we would describe as the gospel of salvation. It's kind of where the cross is the heart of the story, which is absolutely what it should be. You know, the cross and what Jesus did on the cross is the heart of the gospel. But actually, the Bible tells a much, much bigger story stretching over thousands of years, of which the cross is the pivotal point. But actually, when we talk about the good news, Jesus talked about the good news of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Paul, the Apostle Paul, explained more about the gospel of salvation in his writings. Theologically, he unpacked that for us. But the gospel of the kingdom perhaps suggests there's a bigger story, which starts not at Jesus' death and resurrection, but starts back in creation.
Yeah, right at the beginning.
Yeah, where God creates men and women in his own image to partner with him in ruling and reigning on planet Earth, being his co-regents, having the responsibility for looking after creation. And it's only through the fall and the loss of relationship with God and the loss of their sense of purpose and destiny that we go through this 2,000 years of Israel's history before an understanding of the law that took place that helped people understand that they were sinners, they'd fell short of God's standards, and they were cut off from God, and the blood sacrifice that was necessary that all prepared the way for Jesus coming and his death on the cross and his shed blood. But of course, it doesn't finish there either. The Bible goes on to speak about the end purpose being fulfilled. The same purpose that was begun in creation is fulfilled in Revelation, where we see men and women ruling and reigning over the new heavens and the new earth with God forever. And that bigger story actually gives us a few more angles on how we tell God's story. So just a couple of things, for example, there's the idea that we were created with purpose, that God had something in mind when he made us, uniquely gifted personalities, and in relationship with others has given us a job to do. And we can also point towards the fact that actually when we get right with God, when we become part of his family, we're invited to see the fulfillment of that original purpose, which is about fixing everything that's wrong. It's about helping this process of restoration. And we often talk about these 4 movements through the bigger story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And so we don't necessarily explain all of that in 2 minutes to someone who doesn't know Jesus, but it's good to have it in our minds. And when we get the opportunity to describe that bigger story, what we sometimes call the story of God, that we can actually help them understand the bigger purpose. And many people will find that actually really attractive. They may not understand guilt or sin, but they understand the idea of meaning and purpose. and they understand the idea of wanting to fix a broken world and how they can be invited into that process as part of God's family. So I think that's why we've put these 3 examples of the story of God in the handouts for this session. They're just different lengths. Couple done by myself, one by a friend of ours called Caesar Kalinowski. They're just descriptions of that bigger story that help place our understanding of salvation in that bigger picture. So what else have you got to tell us, Jen?
Well, I think one of the things that's important for us to talk about is the context that we're speaking into, and particularly the age of the people that we are talking to. Because different generations have a different experiences of that gospel of salvation in particular. And if you're talking to somebody who's under 40, the chances are that they're not really going to understand or have a big concept of the idea of guilt and sin. That's not part of the vocabulary of those people. But they really do have a really strong connections to things like shame and brokenness. Those are things that people under 40...
And injustice.
Yeah, and injustice, absolutely. And I think when the words that we use to describe God's bigger story are important, we need to think about the person that's receiving them and how they might be thinking about some of those issues. So when we're sharing it, we want to be using appropriate language. That doesn't mean we don't talk about Christ's death and resurrection. We're still going to talk about that, but we want to be using appropriate language. And I think because sin isn't commonly understood, then also forgiveness can be a concept that people also struggle with. And like you said earlier, it can be helpful to be talking about the freedom and the fulfillment that we get through relationship with Jesus. Those are going to be much more appreciated and easy to understand for people.
And also the brokenness of society. They may not feel it sin personally, but they understand we're in a broken world.
I think the minute you look at, you look at just media generally, and the amount of young people that are interested in justice issues, homelessness, climate change, they are interested in fixing injustice. And our God is a God of justice and righteousness. Getting to be part of that bigger story will be important to them. And so that has to feature in our presentation of the gospel, particularly when we're talking about people under 40.
That's really helpful, Jen. And I hope that these little insights to the gospel have helped you in thinking about how you will talk about Jesus and bring the good news to people wherever you are, wherever you live, where we learn, where you work, or where you play. And you're going to have some practical practice at that in a moment. So I hope you have good fun doing it and keep practicing. Not only practicing telling God's story, but telling your story. And the more you do this, the more comfortable and confident you get with it, the better able God will be to use you in every and any situation.